humanist perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello again. I'm Harry Greenberger, and I've been hosting this show for a long time, as you all know. And today I have a very interesting guest, and I'm going to take a little time to tell you something about Paul Mauffray's background. He's a native of Slidell, where he studied classical music and jazz at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, that's NOCA, where he took piano lessons from Moses Hogan. During his undergraduate studies at Louisiana State University, he took part in a study abroad program in Germany, where he had his first conducting lessons with Sergio Celibidache, if I said that correctly.
Celibidache.
Okay. This led to 15 years of professional conducting experience with European orchestras and opera houses, primarily in Prague, Bratislava, Lyon, Salzburg, and Vienna. After studying musicology in Germany and in the Czech Republic, he earned a master's degree in orchestral conducting from Indiana University, where he was an associate instructor. Since then, he has conducted at the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg, that's Russia, not Florida.
Exactly.
And appeared frequently as conductor with violin soloists from the Vienna Philharmonic. He is also a prize winner of international opera competition and has conducted in 16 countries on 3 continents. He is currently reconstructing the unpublished opera Tabasco by George Whitefield Chadwick, which was last performed on tour in, listen to this, 1894, throughout America, including a performance in New Orleans. The performance on March 15th of this year at Trinity Episcopal Church will be the first time that much of the music from this opera has been performed. Now, let me say this, which I have here somewhere. Well, I'll just ask you then how it came about that you are involved with this opera called A Taste of Tabasco.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. A Taste of Tabasco is the name of our concert that we will be presenting, because we're merely offering a taste of the opera. We are not presenting the entire opera yet. As you mentioned, I've worked all around the world. I've been traveling for most of my life now, most of my adult life. And I'm originally from Slidell, though. And so you ask how it is that I came to be involved in this. Well, I come back frequently. You know, a New Orleanian can never be away too long without having some red beans and rice or shrimp po' boys. And I always got to come back for the nice weather. But when I come back, I'm always inspired by the New Orleans Opera. I'm really thankful for people like Arthur Cosenza and Rob Isle, who have helped preserve our wonderful tradition here in New Orleans.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a minute, because the little thing I wanted to I wanted to mention, I want to do that, and then we'll get right back to where you were. And this is what you write, I guess, in your program. It says, although our city is today perhaps better known for jazz, New Orleans has a longer history of performing opera already since 1796. My family, that's you, traces its New Orleans heritage back to the arrival of our French ancestors in 1722.
Right.
So I am particularly interested in the music that was a part of our culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. Recently, while searching through archives of historic New Orleans theaters, I discovered a program from 1894 for an opera named Tabasco, with a libretto by R.A. Barnett and music by George Field Chadwick. I wanted to get that
exactly
into the record.
Yep.
And now after I have interrupted you, go ahead.
That's okay. That's exactly the story. You know, since our family traces its roots back to New Orleans already since 1722, when they were married in St. Louis Cathedral, which I believe was within the first year of it being opened. I've always wondered, what was the opera doing back in the last century or so? I know that we've had opera here since 1796. My first taste of the opera was when I was young. The first opera I heard was here in New Orleans, and later I even went and sang in the opera chorus. So New Orleans opera's always been important to me, and knowing that opera had been around for over a century before jazz even came about, and knowing that that's what our city is mostly noted for. When you think of New Orleans, you think of the good cooking and you think of the jazz, but you don't realize what was here in the French Quarter back in
the
17,
French Quarter,
1800s.
there was what they call the old French Quarter Opera House, which
Exactly.
is no longer there.
The French Opera, yeah. So when I was visiting one time back from Europe a couple years ago, I decided to dig around through some of the old programs to see what was being performed. And there's exciting things you can learn in there. For instance, there's a program for Giuseppe Verdi's La Traviata, which says on the poster, the Brindisi tonight will be sung in Italian. Which is quite funny because it's an Italian opera, and they don't mention anywhere on the poster anything else about the opera being sung in French. It was just taken for granted that everything was sung in French.
All right.
And as I'm digging through these programs and finding wonderful things like La Juive by Halevi and interesting operas by Meyerbeer and such that were performed, I find one program to an opera called Tabasco. And I'm thinking, that can't be Tabasco sauce now, can it? I mean, this was a program from 1894.
Yes.
And sure enough, I think sometimes it says it on the bottles here. No, it doesn't say it on this one, but the Tabasco sauce was actually invented in 1868. And so I go doing a little bit of research on this, and I find out that, sure enough, the opera is about Tabasco sauce. And I even find this picture from the original production, which looks like this. Let me see if you can see that here. And this was what the vocal score looked like back in 1894 or something. And they even have the bottle of Tabasco on the front of it there.
And you were able to find that in some archives.
This you can find easily online, actually. If you look for the Tabasco opera, there's not much out there. But this is one of the things you can find. And the music, though, is something you can't find. What you can find is a simple vocal score that is out there, which has excerpts. And this is printed music, but it's not the entire opera. It's only a few excerpts, and it's in this version, as it says here, performed by Thomas Q. Seabrook. Now, that wasn't his real name, obviously. That was his stage name.
Okay.
He was the producer who took the opera on tour throughout America. And he performed it in many cities, such as...
you have a list of
I've got this incredible list here of all these different cities where the opera was performed, including Louisville, Kentucky, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, Houston, Texas, Austin, Fort Worth, Dallas, Little Rock, Memphis, and of course, New Orleans.
Is it your impression that in these list of cities that they were culturally prepared for opera?
I'm not entirely sure about that, but I should also mention that it's not just an opera. As it says here on the title, it's called the Burlesque Opera of Tabasco. So it was burlesque. And
when I'm looking at places like Paris, Kentucky, and Selma,
Alabama, exactly.
Those there was an audience there for this.
I assume what they had was a stage. And you can kind of connect the dots and realize this was a traveling troupe that just went from town to town putting on the show. And how this originated was they were doing a benefit for some cadets, for some Army cadets in Boston.
Okay.
And all of the young cadets were performing, the young men. So all the female roles were sung by men.
Uh-huh.
And in drag, I suppose you would say these days.
These days you would.
And the first review, the first newspaper review, the headline reads, "Girls Clean Shaven." And it praises the shapely, clean-shaven legs of the harem girls, which weren't harem girls at all. They were the Army cadets dressed in drag. So it was quite a fun type of an evening of entertainment. Nothing to be taken too seriously. When you say opera, you're thinking of some big Italian, German, French opera. This was more along the lines of operetta, like Johann Strauss or Gilbert and Sullivan.
Okay.
And what's interesting about Gilbert and Sullivan, I mentioned that, is because George Whitefield Chadwick studied composition in Leipzig, in Germany. And you know who else studied in Leipzig at the same music conservatory? Arthur Sullivan. Arthur Sullivan is, of course, the Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan. So when George Whitefield Chadwick is writing an operetta that's quite in the style of Gilbert and Sullivan, he's just not imitating his older colleague, who he probably knew, but he's writing in the style of someone who studied from some of the same teachers at the same school.
And were they New Orleanians?
No. Actually, the New Orleans connection with this opera is simply that it passed through town and it was performed here. And it's about Tabasco sauce.
Except that Tabasco is a Louisiana product.
Exactly. And I should get to the plot of it so that you know about that.
Carry on.
Actually, the opera, when it was taken on tour, the producer, this Thomas Q. Seabrook, he was swindling the composer out of his royalties. They weren't sending back the royalty checks, and he started even changing the name of the opera so that it was no longer about Tabasco sauce, so that he could pretend like it was something new. And when the composer caught wind of that, then he immediately withdrew the opera, took it back, hid it away, and it's never been heard since then. Just to let you know, it's good music.
Let me be sure I understand what you say. This has not been performed since the 1800s.
Since 1894, exactly, 120 years ago.
All right.
And the reason, and a lot of people are apprehensive because they think the operas that we know, the good ones, they're there because they've stood the test of time. Mm-hmm. And that's true. They've stood the test of time through repeat hearings. People know that the music is good. When I bring up something that people have never heard before, they're sometimes apprehensive because they think, well, if it was any good, we would have heard of it. But actually, in this case, it was good. The reviews were great. It was successful. It played 48 performances when it opened up in New York. And the only reason we haven't heard about it was because the composer took it, hid it away, was going through legal problems with the producers and didn't want to have any more trouble with it. But let me get to the plot, because it's a real fun story.
Tell us.
It's just like some of those topsy-turvy Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. There's an Irish fellow named Dennis O'Grady, and he gets shipwrecked in Tangier. And when he's shipwrecked, the first people he meets warn him that he must have gainful employment at this place. Otherwise, unemployed people are beheaded. And the next person he meets is the Grand Vizier, like the henchman for the Pasha, who comes with his scimitar and says, he asks him if he has any employment, what he does for a living, and because if he doesn't have a job, he'll have to behead him. And he also says, I hope you're going to tell me that you're a cook, because I just had to behead our cook this morning. The cook was no good. And when he asks the Irishman if he's a cook, he says, no, I'm not a cook, I'm a chef. He asks, well, what's the difference between a cook and a chef? And he says, $200 a week. That's the difference. And so now he says, of course, if you're a chef, that means you must be French. And the Irishman says, mais oui, of course I'm French. And now you've got an Irishman putting on a French accent the whole time.
I see. So this show is a comedy.
It's a comedy, and it's in English. And there's lots of dialogue. That's what makes it funny. And you've got this Irishman pretending to be a French cook, and everybody knows the Irish aren't really known for their cooking. And when he makes a meal, it's bland and dull. And the Pasha wants things hot and spicy with bang. You can see where this is leading, can't you?
Okay.
And he tells the Irishman that, who he thinks is French, of course, he tells him if he doesn't cook a spicy meal by dinner, that he'll be beheaded. So now when he's on the beach bemoaning his fate and worried that he's going to be beheaded that evening, magically he discovers a bottle of Tabasco from the shipwreck. And when he puts that on the food, of course, that saves his neck. And there's a lot more to it. In the end, they have to come up with a whole crate of Tabasco. So the Tabasco features as the key thing. And what's nice, too, is that we have a letter from some lawyers and from the composer that I found where they mention that the Tabasco company was actually sponsoring it back then. The composer had to write to the Tabasco company to ask them if they could use their product. It wasn't intended as an opera, like a marketing type of opera or an advertisement for Tabasco. Tabasco wasn't even some prominent item throughout the opera. It just plays the key role, and they thought it would, be a wonderful gimmick in the end. But it's quality music. And they had to get the permission of the Tabasco company, and the Tabasco company said they would be glad to be a part of it and help sponsor the performances if they included prominently this big bottle of Tabasco on the stage in the performances. And the Tabasco company invented this tiny bottle right here, which is an 1/8 of an ounce. And the little 1/8 ounce bottles were invented specifically for this performance in 1894. When they took it on tour, they gave out little samples of this bottle to the audience.
Into all of those cities where they
cities where they would they would be performing.
Okay.
And so the actual music, as I mentioned, you can find some of the vocal score online. It's riddled with mistakes, and it's only an arrangement that had been completely changed while they were on tour, and it doesn't include any of the dialogue, and you can't find the actual original orchestration by looking for that. And I did years of research and found where the actual autograph manuscript is hidden, and I've made digital copies of the entire thing. And here's a copy, for instance, of what the music looks like. You can see some of the autograph manuscript music, how it looks here. And I'm actually spending my time now, piece by piece, reconstructing this autograph manuscript and putting it into music notation software so that I can print it out for the orchestra musicians. And we are hiring out some players from, mostly they're from the Louisiana Philharmonic. We've got about 18 musicians in the orchestra that we've hired out from them, individual players. And we will be having the Symphony Chorus of New Orleans and 5 opera singers, Kenneth Weber from Loyola, Taylor Miller, a local singer, Betsy Ushkrat, Tyler Smith. They both teach on the faculty at Loyola University, or they're adjunct voice instructors, and also Rebecca Coe. So we have 5 opera soloists, symphony chorus, 18-piece chamber orchestra, and we're going to play many of the excerpts from the Tabasco opera so that people can get a taste of Tabasco
that's why
we're calling it a taste. Exactly.
And that's going to be performed when and where?
That will be performed at Trinity Episcopal Church, which is on Jackson Avenue in the heart of the Garden District in New Orleans. The performance will be Saturday, March 15th at 7:30 p.m. And there happens to be the Irish Channel Parade earlier that day. We're sure that this won't interfere with the performance at all. The parade is at 1 p.m. and our performance is at 7:30 p.m. I only mention that so that people know that if they see there's a parade, don't be worried, it won't interfere. It'll be over long before.
Some of those paraders might come to your show slightly tipsy.
Hopefully, yes. And what's funny about it, too, is a great coincidence because the opera has a bit of a St. Patrick's theme to it. I mentioned that the leading character, Dennis O'Grady, is Irish, and he has 2 Irish songs in there, so it will work perfectly for the St. Patrick's Day theme. One of them, he even sings, he says, "Oh, Cupid's a paddy, St. Pat was his daddy." I love that line.
Or you have tickets? Are the tickets for sale, or do you take reservations,
it's
or
actually,
what?
It's actually free. We're offering this free to the public, but come early, because the last time I did a concert at Trinity, it was pretty much sold out, standing room only, and it seats well over 600 people. Trinity Episcopal Church is a great acoustic for concerts. They do classical concerts every Sunday at 5 p.m., just put in a little plug for their classical music series.
Okay.
Our concert, however, is not on the Sunday 5 p.m. series. Our concert will be Saturday night, March 15th at 7:30 p.m.
Okay, but you don't take reservations. You just come and...
No, we don't. We're trying to plan some type of a reception, because I know that the McElhennys will be there. And the CEO of the McElhenny Company, which makes Tabasco, he's coming, and their historian is coming, and so we will have a lot of guests from Tabasco land, from Avery Island. So we need to plan some type of a reception, and we're toying with the idea of selling VIP tickets to the reception, which could include some type of reserved seating. So keep a lookout for that.
Okay, now are they going to bring those little tiny bottles?
Yes, I hope they will be bringing, they mentioned they would be doing that. In fact, they said they could even print a special label for our opera on the bottle. So hopefully the label on the bottle will say something about the opera, and we can give those out to people at the concert.
Now, is this a one-time only event, or are you planning to repeat it or take it on the road, or what are you going to do with it?
That's a great question. You know, when I discovered this opera and I realized the music is so good in it, and some of the tunes just stuck in my head all year long. They're really great music. I started realizing that this needs to get out there. People need to get familiar with it. And so last year in February, we did a small private little salon recital for about 30 or 40 select invited guests to give them a taste of the Tabasco opera. And this was just done with piano and many of these same 5 singers. And it's taking me quite a while. I have a busy schedule. I'm traveling all the time, conducting. I did 5 concerts in Vienna this year, and I frequently conduct in the Czech Republic. And while I'm on the road, it's not as easy to be reconstructing the opera. So when I come back to New Orleans, I have more time to sit at the computer and write out the music. And slowly, bit by bit, I'm reconstructing it. For instance, the overture, which was never published, and I have right here. This is what the overture looked like, and I'm slowly reconstructing the notes and making it possible to perform this with an orchestra. So when you ask about if this is a one-time event, no, this is just the beginning. We've only just begun. We're getting it out there so that opera organizations, such as in many of these cities that I mentioned here, New Orleans, Atlanta, Houston, Charleston, Birmingham, so that they can get an idea that this is something that's of historical significance to their hometown and their culture. It was performed here 120 years ago, and now that we're reconstructing it, now that we're able to perform it with an 18-piece chamber orchestra in March of 2014, by November of 2014, we're planning it potentially in one of these cities, a full orchestral concert that would involve a much larger orchestra, about a 40-piece orchestra along with the chorus.
But now, would that be the total opera or just the taste that you're talking?
It's a good thing you asked. It depends on how much time I have to sit at the computer and write the opera out, because I'm not entrusting any of this work to anybody else.
Well, how long would the full opera run?
That's a good question. Nobody knows yet, because I haven't finished it. But at the moment, I've got about 40 minutes worth of excerpts that are ready to be performed in March. By November, I'm assuming there will be at least 45 minutes to an hour's worth of music that we can do with full orchestra. I assume the musical content of the opera is going to be about 90 minutes worth of music, but you also have the dialogue, so it can make for a full evening. And slowly we're working our way up to the point, like workshopping it, so that in a few years we will be able to perform the entire thing with the dialogue and the sets and the costumes. And as a coincidence, in 2018, it will be the 150th anniversary of the McElhenny Company and Tabasco sauce. Tabasco sauce was invented in 1868. So by 2018, they will be celebrating their 150th anniversary. I believe 2018 will also be some big celebration in New Orleans as well. Don't we have a big cultural celebration going on there?
I don't know.
I've forgotten the word for it, but that would be a perfect time to get the whole opera performed.
All
That's
right.
when we're planning the grand opening of the entire opera.
Now, you are yourself reconstructing this.
Exactly.
What does that have to do with copyright rights
Oh, boy, let's not get into that. That's very complicated. I'm reconstructing, for instance, here's a copy of the music that I've already edited to the March. Now, the March is a very confusing story already in itself, because the March was the most popular part of the Tabasco opera, and he took it as an excerpt and sold it to somebody else and gave up the rights to it. And they sold it to other publishers, and it got published more than 100,000 times. So that was a really popular excerpt back in the day. What I'm doing right now, though, since I have access to the autographed manuscript, is I'm creating my own arrangement. That way I can have the copyright on it. The arrangement that we're performing is in my orchestration, because I've had to tweak many of the details to reconstruct things based on the original performance. So it's at the one time authentic, because I'm basing it on the original autographed manuscript, but on the other hand, it's also my proprietary copyright, because it's my orchestration.
And the original copyrights long ago ran out.
Long ago, yes.
Well,
And
that's all very exciting, and we still have a few minutes to talk. So, tell us what more you can tell us about what you're doing.
Well, it's funny. Just this morning when I woke up and was coming to do this interview, I remembered this book that I had read by Paul Coelho called The Alchemist. Now, if you haven't read it, I hate to give away the ending, but I guess I have to give away the ending, because that's what reminded me here of this. The book The Alchemist is about a young man who hears about some buried treasure, or someone has given him this clue that there's this buried treasure somewhere that he can find, and he has to go on a long journey for years and years in search of where he can find the key element that will tell him where this treasure is buried. And when he gets to the end of his journey, very, very far away, he finds out, they tell him, that the treasure is actually buried right in his backyard, where he was originally from, where he started his journey. And when he goes back home, sure enough, he gets a shovel and he digs it up, and there it is. And he says it's the spoils of a conquest that the country had long ago forgotten. And I feel like that's exactly my case, because I've spent the last 20 years or so, actually almost 25 years
digging in your own
now.
backyard.
No, I'm not digging in my own backyard. I've spent the last more than the 20 years traveling throughout Europe, conducting in 16 different countries, living in Prague, living in Vienna. And mostly I've been over there digging up information about composers like Leos Janáček, living in the city where he composed, digging up his autographed manuscripts, finding these gems in the Czech Republic to present their Czech music to them in the way that I found it in their autographed manuscript. Or just this summer I was conducting Mozart in the hall where Mozart himself conducted the Impresario opera, and I conducted that opera in the actual hall where he conducted it. And I'm doing these things where the composers were, and so it's great to finally be able to bring it back to America to find a treasure in our own backyard of this music that's about our hometown, and it was performed here 120 years ago, and I'm able to share it with our public.
Paul, you have been a delightful guest.
Thank you for having me, Harry.
And we look forward to
the
the taste of Tabasco.
Great.
And thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, folks, for watching our show today.